Hey guys, my name is Michaela and I am a tutor at the Robinson Writing Center. Today I will be taking you guys through quote integration. So first of all, what is it? Well, quote integration is when you extract pieces from the text and seamlessly blend into your analysis. But why do we integrate quotes? Well, firstly, they prove your thesis. Quotations pulled directly from the literary text that you are analyzing is the strongest form of evidence that you could have. Secondly, they present your perception of the text. Your use of quotations, the way that you introduce them, will show your audience the context in which you interpreted the text. And lastly, they provide context. The use of quotations in your analysis will establish your thought process to the readers. So, in other words, they show your audience how you were able to reach the original idea of your thesis. But how do we integrate quotes? Well, as with a lot of writing, there are multiple ways to execute this technique of quote integration. I am going to talk through 3 different ways to implement this technique. And to be able to help a larger number of writers who have all mastered different levels of writing difficulty, I will introduce 3 different ways in which one can integrate a quote, all 3 approaches varying in difficulty. So this first technique is one that I think is best fit for a beginner. This technique consists of a complete sentence to introduce the quote, which is then followed by a colon to separate it from the chosen quotation. I get if you guys don't completely understand what I mean at this point, but I will be providing examples to help clarify my explanation once I get through all the different ways to integrate a quote. The second approach consists of an introductory or an explanatory phrase. This part of the sentence is what I would consider a dependent clause, if it helps to think about it in that way. It is then followed by a comma to separate it from the quotation. I find this technique will best fit the writing abilities of an intermediate writer. The last approach is one that I feel will best suit the abilities of a more advanced writer, and this technique consists of a short quotation, typically only a few words, that is used as a part of your own sentence. So going back to our first technique, the one that consists of a complete sentence to introduce the quote followed by a colon. So our first example is, in John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, it is made clear that despite his feelings of obligation to his friend, George feels a sense of resentment towards Lenny. God Almighty, if I was alone I could live so easy. So in this sentence, we can see that the first part of the sentence can completely stand on its own, but with the use of the quotation, we help strengthen the validity of our claim. So here are a couple more examples that you guys can look at for reference. So moving on to our second technique, the one that consists of an introductory or an explanatory phrase, which isn't a complete sentence, that is then followed by a comma. This technique is typically used when your introductory or explanatory phrase ends with the following verbs: says, thinks, believes, and other similar signal verbs. So our first example is, when suggested that Ralph chastise the uncooperative boys, he says, I bet if I blew the conch this minute, they'd come running. When the meeting was over, they'd work for 5 minutes, then wander off or go hunting. In this example, we can see that the introductory phrase would not be able to stand on its own because it isn't a complete sentence. And like I previously said, the introductory phrase ends with the word says, and is separated from the quote with a comma. Here are 2 more examples that you guys could look at. And on to our last technique, the one in which you use a short quotation from the text and uses it as a part of your own sentence. Here is our first example. It is clear that Lenny is subjected to George's authority because when confronted about the dead mouse that he was keeping, Lenny's hand slowly obeyed. So in this example, we see that the quotation is only a few words long and it is used in a way that incorporates it smoothly into the sentence written. Also, nothing is used to separate the quote from what I had written. Here are a couple more examples to look at. So as writers, either for academic purposes or enjoyment purposes, we are all at different levels or stages in our abilities. But I suggest as you progress and improve your abilities, try the more difficult approach of incorporating quotes. So, the last thing that I want to talk to you guys about are what are things to avoid when incorporating quotes. So, the first thing I would suggest to avoid are freestanding quotes. This is because we use quotations to further prove our analysis, and as writers with an intended audience, we can't assume that the quote speaks for itself. The second would be not providing an introduction. And without an introduction, there's no context for the quote that is used. And without any context, then there's nothing to signal to the audience what part of the text that you are referring to or how this quotation ties back to what you're trying to prove in your thesis. And lastly, I would suggest avoiding not analyzing the quote. And I don't want to talk too much about this common mistake because it is another complex idea, but it is an important reminder that when analyzing literary work, you need to make sure that you're analyzing the quote used. There needs to be a reason that you have chosen that quote. And if you guys want to learn more about how to analyze a quote, there is another screencast by the Robinson Writing Center available for you guys to watch. So those are the main ideas that I want to go over in regards to quote integration, but I have a recap just so we can review what you guys have gone over. So the three reasons that we integrate quotes is that quotes are our strongest form of evidence. They allow the audience to see your point of view of the text. And lastly, quotes reveal the thought process you went through to reach your thesis. And we integrate quotes in three different ways. So essentially, the easiest way is two independent clauses, an introductory sentence in the quote itself, separated only using a colon. Our second technique of integrating quotes is a dependent and an independent clause, the introductory phrase acting as a dependent clause and the quote acting as the independent clause, only separated using a comma. And our last way of integrating quotes would be using only a few words that are extracted from the text and used as a part of your own sentence. And the things that we want to avoid when integrating quotes are freestanding quotes because they don't add anything more to your analysis, providing no context for the quote because there's nothing to signal to your audience what section of the text you're referring to or the relevance of the quote in your analysis, and not analyzing the quotes because there needs to be a specific reason that you use the quote, so you need to make sure that you're providing the audience with that reason. So in a nutshell, that is quote integration. I hope I was able to help you guys understand what this technique is and help clarify some things for you. Thanks for watching, and I hope you guys are able to watch the rest of the screencast provided by the Robinson Writing Center.